damn, 2 videos in 2 weeks? Who am I and what have I done with the real Lyle McDonald? We'll see if I keep doing this. So if you're wondering why I'm in a hoodie, it's cold as balls here in Austin. It's 16 degrees today, which I didn't move to Texas for this. Anyway, I know I'm late to the game, but based on what I talked about last week, once again, I'm sure Brad addressed critically, coherently, and directly, as he always does, I wanted to talk about that idiotic 52 set per week volume study that all the screeching cretins jumped on last year because it fit their bias, and who, as always, seemed to leave out some of the important details about what was done and what happened. But that's where I come in. So the paper in question is Enes et al. Effects of different weekly set progressions on muscular adaptations in trained males. Is there a dose-response effect? Published in MedSci Sports Exercise 2023, October 6th, online ahead of print. Unfortunately, I do not have a link to give you to get a free full text. However, as usual, I'm just going to put up screenshots so you can see what the paper actually said rather than what the others do, which is tell you what it said, misrepresent what it actually said, and then just know that you'll trust them. So you don't need the full paper. Moving on. So the paper really had 2 goals. Well, one was to look at the issue of differences in volumes, and the other had to do with the idea of progressing volumes. Towards that, the paper says. So in the introduction, they state first, regarding muscle hypertrophy, previous studies utilizing different resistance training volumes, ranging from 3 to 45 weekly sets per muscle group, have produced divergent findings in resistance-trained individuals. For example, some studies comparing low, less than 12 weekly sets, moderate, 12 to 20 weekly sets, and high volume, greater than 20 weekly sets, found beneficial effects to higher training volumes. In contrast, others reported relatively similar hypertrophic adaptations between groups. Now, the reference studies here, reference 4 is Brad's volume study, which compared 9, 27, 45 sets per week for lower body. I forget the upper body numbers. Number 6 was a ridiculous study by Brigado that compared 16, 24, and 32 sets per week. So it was 8, 12, and 16 sets per workout. And the leg workouts are even less believable. Supposedly it was 8 by 8 to 10 RM on 60-second rest squats, followed by 8 more sets of 8 to 10 leg extensions on 60 seconds. And as always, show me the fucking video. Because anyone truly squatting even close to rep max on 60 seconds will be vomiting by set 3. And if you ever get to Austin, I'll prove it to you. Or send me a video and prove me wrong. Reference 3 was the study by Aub et al. That I mentioned last week. Number 8, Ostrowski, and 10 was Hieselgrade. All 3 of which found the same growth between all the volume groups with no significant difference. So the same 3 of the same papers that the thing I looked at last week examined. And I do wish last week's paper had included the Brigado study, because I'm willing to bet you they were seeing water too, but I believe they wrote their paper probably before Brigado was published. Anyway, the researchers continue. Importantly, the studies that observed benefits from higher training volumes showed no clear benefits compared to moderate training volumes. Less sentences sure is funny, right? Because these volume studies, everybody seems to kind of misrepresent. More volume is better. Brad even pretended his statistics didn't apply, because they only apply to other papers, by making it sound like the highest volume group was the best, when statistically, the moderate group was just as good. Or rather, the highest volume group was no better than moderate. The same in Brigado. It's the same point that the paper I talked about last week made. Yes, moderate volumes are frequently better than lower volumes, where you're invariably comparing optimal volumes to suboptimal volumes. But excessive volumes are literally never better than moderate. And somehow that gets left out of the discussion by everybody but me. Oh, as a final point, and again, I'm not going to screenshot it all, so I'm not just reading to you this entire time. They do point out that previous studies have not taken into account the pre-study resistance training volumes. And there are a couple studies that bring people in and then change their volumes from what they were typically doing. So that was kind of a third goal of this study. They then state, additionally, progressive overload is recommended to prevent plateaus in resistance-trained individuals, typically involving increasing load or volume during a training cycle. Although researchers have proposed volume progressions, including cyclic increases in weekly sets, there's a lack of empirical data on this subject, and no investigation has contrasted cyclic weekly set increases with a fixed resistance training volume scheme. Now they reference number 12 in that is an article that Mike Israetel and a couple others wrote for the Strength and Conditioning Journal that was hilarious because it made a bunch of dumb inferences. And then, not shockingly, reference 13 is a paper on evidence-based resistance training recommendations by, take one guess, Brad. I picked a graduate supervisor who shared my high volume bias, Schoenfeld. Shocking. They continue. Moreover, Hahn et al. Had trained males progressing from 10 to 32 sets within a 6-week period. While their study primarily aimed to investigate the effects of supplementation interventions on muscle mass accrual, the muscle thickness and fiber cross-sectional area decreased midway through the study, with post-testing showing no significant differences from the pre-test values across conditions. Nevertheless, the absence of a group following a fixed set number prevents us from drawing more specific conclusions. Therefore, whether cyclical resistance training volume progressions confer benefits or have detrimental effects on muscular adaptations in trained individuals remains to be elucidated. Now that study by Hahn, that's the one that Mike Israetel was on, that started at 10 sets per week, ramped up to 32 sets per week over 6 weeks, and found no net growth. So it was a lot of work to accomplish jack fucking shit. A little more complicated. I've talked about that one before, and I'm not going to go into the details. I find it interesting that this paper fails to mention that what little supposed growth was seen in terms of lean body mass or whatever, as the volumes went up, was water. And I mentioned that last week as well. And I do think conclusions can be drawn. It's fucking dumb. Also, the workout made no sense. They did repeat sets of 10 on 4 reps in reserve with a 10-minute rest between sets of the same exercise. So they did a whole bunch of warm-up sets. So that study, while interesting, proved nothing other than high volumes when you do a ton of warm-up sets make you gain some water weight. Fantastic. Anyway, the goal of this paper was to address this limitation by looking at different volumes, progressive volumes compared to a fixed volume group, and they set it up specifically to try to avoid any issues with the pre-study training volumes impacting the results. So let's look briefly at the methods. I'm not going to screenshot most of this because it's boring. And again, if you haven't figured it out, I'm not lying to you about what the study says, and the methods are boring. All right, so what subject? They got a bunch of people, subjects age 18 to 30 years that had at least 2 years of consistent resistance training performance with a minimum frequency of 4 days per week. Negative answers on the PAR-Q, minimum barbell back squat of 1.5 times body mass, no creatine for 6 months, self-report of no anti-inflammatory drugs or anabolic androgenic steroid use, and then there were some exclusion criteria that aren't really that interesting. So as always, they did a bunch of stuff. They did a diet record, which is shit because it's all self-reported and it doesn't matter. And it's uncontrolled, and it's not a good reason to dismiss these studies because no study ever has diet controlled, so I'm not going to come back to that. They measured 1 rep max squat strength, which is fine. I might question the ability of the average resistance trained person with 2 years plus to generate a true max, but whatever. More interestingly, I want to talk about how they did the muscle, the measurements. So they used ultrasound, like is typically done, and they measured 2 things. One was vastus lateralis muscle cross-sectional area, right? And then they also measured the muscle thickness of the lateral thigh. Now this is important because the way they did it, they were actually measuring changes in thickness of the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris, the one hip flexor that crosses the knee. But what that means is that any of the changes in either direction for muscle thickness were including 2 muscles, which is very different from how most studies do it. When most studies do muscle thickness, they do 1 muscle. This was combining 2. Anyway, they used fairly standard protocols I'm not going to bore you with. However, trained ultrasound technician blinded to group allocation did the work. So already this paper is more valid and better done than all of the papers Brad did until recently when he wrote that self-pretentious thing on papers need to be blinded. So that's good. They blinded the allocator. To bring it up, they did the exact same thing that I mentioned in last week's little paper. They did the post-workout remeasurement 72 hours after the study, which may or may not be valid depending on the volumes used. So now let's talk about the workout. Study design is a little convoluted, but it is that way because the researchers actually tried to set it up to do something semi-intelligent. So I'm not criticizing it. I'm actually trying to say that this is a good aspect of the paper. It divided into 5 phases and was technically 19 weeks long, of which 16 was the actual training, and you'll see this in the next set of images. All right, so the first 2 weeks were just baseline, get the subjects in, do the measurements, do the 1RM test, and then they were put into the 3 different groups, which I will explain momentarily. So the next 2 weeks was a washout period with a volume reduction. And what they did is all the subjects who had self-reported doing like 15 sets of quadriceps, quad training per week, reduced their volume each week by 40%. Basically what they wanted to do was to eliminate the effects of any previous workout in terms of the results are being seen. And this is really good. This should probably be done by more groups, assuming they have time, like this methodology. Moving on. All right, so next up was a 2-week familiarization phase, where they increased the volumes of the 3 different groups to get them close to the baselines that they wanted. And so you'll see 3 groups. CG, that stands for the constant volume group. 4SG was the group that would add 4 sets per every 2 weeks, and 6SG was 6 sets every 2 weeks. So they ramped them up. See, in week 1, 14, 14, and 10 sets for the 3 different groups. Week 2, 18, 18, and 16. And then finally was the main part of the study, which was 12 weeks long. So one group, the constant set group, from weeks 1 to 12, did 22 sets per week. The 4-set group in weeks 1 and 2 did 22 sets per week, and then they added 4 sets per week every 2 weeks. Then the 6-set group, same thing, weeks 1 and 2, 22 sets per week, and then they added 6 sets per week every 2 weeks. And this is what took them to the final volumes, which I'll talk about in a second. And then finally, post-training 1 week where they redid the ultrasound. Again, 72 hours, possibly not long enough to let fluid dissipate. And so what you end up with over the 12 weeks is the constant set group just did 22 sets. The 4-set every 2 weeks group did 22, then 26, 30, 34, 38, ending at 42 sets per week. And the 6 sets per week group did 22, 28, 34, 40, 46, and a whopping 52 sets per week. Now to keep that in context, let's talk about the actual workout that was done. All right, the training intervention. Participants performed a lower limb resistance training program twice per week for 12 weeks, totaling 24 sessions, professional supervised all training sessions, blah, blah, blah. To minimize any confounding variables, participants were instructed to refrain from any additional lower limb resistance training or high intensity exercise. Participants were allowed to train their upper body muscles as they pleased. So not that it realistically matters, but the upper body resistance training was not prescribed. And I can guarantee you that if the evidence-based fitness group who jumped all over this paper, like a drowning person to a life raft, didn't like the results, they would absolutely throw it out based on that. Oh, well, they didn't tell them what to do for upper body, so it doesn't count. And you all know I'm right. Since there shouldn't be any overlap between upper body and legs and people are doing something very, very wrong, I don't think it matters either way. All experimental groups underwent the same resistance training scheme, differing only the number of quadricep sets performed per week for the barbell back squat, 45-degree leg press, and seated leg extension. Given that muscle strength has greater loading specificity than muscle hypertrophy, we alternated between lower repetition, 6 to 8, and higher repetition, 10 to 12 rep schemes for each exercise in the first and second training sessions during the week, respectively. All right, so no real problem for me with that. They split the volume, 2 workouts per week. I would note that, as they state, to reduce the likelihood of dropouts and ensure consistency, we incorporated lower body posterior chain exercises, meaning that they did 2 sets of leg curls and RDLs at each workout. And I was going to say that that wasn't representative of the average trainee's leg training, but it probably is, because most people don't seem to realize that they have muscles on the back of their body. Moving on. The intensity of effort was set at 2 repetitions in reserve, with the last set of each exercise performed a volitional concentric failure, i.e. the inability to perform an additional concentric action while preserving appropriate exercise form or voluntary discontinuation of the set. If the participant could not achieve the lower limit of the prescribed repetition range or perform the set with relative ease, the load was either reduced or increased for the next set respectively. If a participant reached concentric failure in the last set of an exercise and exceeded the upper limit of the prescribed repetition range for that training session, the load was increased in the subsequent training session to ensure that the participant remained within the intended repetition range. Okay, so the total volumes, which I'll show you in a second, all of the sets until the last one on each exercise were at 2 reps in reserve, and then the final set was to concentric failure. But once again, they're using that technical failure thing, and on squats especially, on people that are not highly skilled at squats, you and I and anyone who has ever been in a fucking gym knows the technique breaks down long before true failure. Highly skilled people can do it, but the average trainee cannot. So you know full well that for most people, those squats were not at 2 reps in reserve or to true failure. Now, leg press, leg extension, there shouldn't be any failure to occur. Form failure. Leg press, what? Knees break in. I mean, the other issue with the technical failure thing is, how is it being defined? Who's defining it? Who's deciding when technique has degraded enough for the set to be over? Was it an upright squatter bends over a little bit more, knees break? How are you objectively defining technical failure? Which is why, again, we need to see videos of these workouts. I'm not saying that there's a solution, but we have to define this. Or stop using fucking back squats. Use exercises where there is no technical failure. But they also include volitional failure, which is one of the worst definitions. Because what that means is that people stop when they have decided that the next rep will be failure, which means that most people are going to stop when it just gets harder than what they want to continue doing. When it gets too uncomfortable, they will decide that they are done, even if they are far from muscular failure. It'll be the worst on back squats. It'll be less of a problem on leg press, but still, true failure is when you cannot move the sled, not it hurts more than I want to keep going. And leg extensions, I'd say it's the least, but again, leg extensions hurt like hell to true 0 reps in reserve, and most people are simply going to quit long before they get close to true muscular failure, which is the only definition that matters. And y'all know I'm right. Anyway, all the sets were 2 reps in reserve until the last one, which is to failure. It's not in the screenshots. The only thing listed about rest intervals is that they were given at least 2 minutes between sets. And I would love to have some data or love to know what they did. Why they didn't set it more specifically is beyond me. That could be 2 minutes and 10 seconds. That could be 5 minutes between sets. And it wouldn't surprise me if the higher volume groups were taking longer, but we don't know that. All right, you can see the set progressions in each group. And so the final workout in weeks 11 and 12, the constant set group did 8, 8, and 6 sets per week of squat, leg press, and leg extension, which means 4, 4, and 3 per workout. Pretty reasonable. It's 11 total sets. The 4 set per week group did 14, 14, and 14 sets total for 7, 7, and 7 squat, leg press, leg extension, respectively. And the 6 set per week group did 18, 18, and 16 total sets per week for 9 sets of back squats, 9 sets of leg press, and 8 sets of leg extension. So that's 8 sets of back squats to 2 reps in reserve, 1 set to failure. 8 sets to 2 reps in reserve on leg press, 1 set to failure. 7 sets of leg extensions at 2 reps in reserve, 1 set to failure. The other thing to note is that they were adjusting the weights during the workout to maintain the repetition range. So if they hit the low end of the range, 10 on the 10 to 12 days, 6 on the 6 to 8 days, they reduce the weight. In my Facebook group, as I always do, I challenged anyone to prove that they could do this workout. And before he got his feelings hurt in my group over words on a screen, and little Milo Wolf, shown here, did. He stepped up, he sent me the video, he completed it well enough, and I sent him $1,000 as I promised. Betty hasn't mentioned that while he's being bitchy about me. Regardless, on his back squat, the weights dropped from like 335 on the first set to about 185 by the 9th set. If you don't think that's junk volume, then you are the one that has no clue how to train. Anyway, let's look at the results. All right, so maximum strength if you care. The higher volume groups did see a greater increase in squat strength than the fixed set group, but there were no difference between the moderate and high groups. And that's not really a big surprise, right? I mean, they did more sets of squats, and generally doing more sets of squats up to a point does make you stronger over time. But again, moderate and high were both better than the fixed group. One comment on the squat thing. Remember, if you're talking about squat improvements, you're only talking about the squat sets. The 22 set group did 4 sets twice a week, 8 total sets per week. The 4 set group finished at 7 sets twice a week, and the 6 set group finished at 18 sets per week. So you're not actually looking at 22 versus 46 versus 52 sets when you're talking about the squats. You're looking at 8 versus 14 versus 18. Those are pretty moderate volumes. So at best, we might argue that compared to doing only 8 sets per week of squats, doing 14 is better, but doing 18 is no better. Who gives a fuck about the strength gains? Let's talk about the hypertrophy results. And be forewarned, these are a little bit entrenched, and I will do my best to de-entrench them, and I'll be using a lot of screenshots because this gets a little bit confusing. Okay, so like I said, this is pretty entrenched. They state all groups increase their vastus lateralis cross-sectional area after the intervention, indicating a main effective time. This means they grew over time. However, there were no significant time by group interactions. Look at that p-value, 0.067. That means that between groups, there was no statistically significant difference in the amount of growth. Then they look at a bunch of between group comparisons and confidence intervals. And like I said, I'm not going to read all that to you. Mainly just note there's a lot of variation in the differences. Post-hoc comparisons revealed no between group differences for vastus lateralis cross-sectional area among groups. And you can see this when you look at the plotted data on the next image, which there's just a ton of variance in the amount of growth seen in each group, right? Some folks grew really well. Some folks, it was a relatively flat line. One poor dude in the highest volume group actually lost size. And when you aggregate average data, you end up with no statistically significant difference. Now, this is a little bit easier to see. This kind of plot shows the big black circle, black dot is the average result, and then those kind of gray curves show the variation. And looked at this way, you do see that, okay, the 4 and 6 group do seem to have gotten better growth than the fixed set group, but they, on average, were no different from one another. And maybe more interestingly is that the highest volume group showed the most variation. The gray curve is bigger, but again, statistically, did not reach significance between groups. Now let's look at the muscle thickness, which let me remind you was the sum of the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris. I'm emphasizing that because it means that any growth or difference in growth is representing size changes in 2 muscles. So simplistically and incorrectly, we could just divide it in half to see how much the individual muscles grow. And I don't really know why they did it this way, other than maybe it was to try to get a more significant result. Don't know. But again, any value, any changes you see are for 2 muscles. So split it in half to see how much the different muscles grew, which basically just says the same thing. All groups increased their sum of muscle thickness portions among lateral thigh compared to baseline. However, mixed models revealed no time by group interactions, p equals 0.076. There was no statistically significant difference between the 3 groups, the lowest, the medium, and the highest volume groups, for changes in muscle thickness. It did not reach statistical significance. And it's for exactly the same reason. There's just huge variability. It's interesting to me that more people actually showed decreases in muscle thickness for that lateral thigh in each group, but there's just huge overlapping variation. And again, same thing. You look at that other plot. Yeah, it looks like the 4 group and the 6 group were a little bit higher, but there's huge amounts of overlap. And the reality is that according to the p-value that was chosen, there was no statistically significant difference between groups. And no, I'm not done discussing this. So there's a fair amount of debate right now about the utility of p-values and whether or not results should be presented as either statistically significant or not. I'm not going to get into that. So there's something called an effect size, which is a little bit more, in the broadest sense, it examines the effect size of the difference within a group or between groups. It's a little bit more gradated. It's arguably a little bit more accurate, and most studies these days give both, and I want to look at the effect sizes for this study next. All right, so B is the cross-sectional area changes, and C was the muscle thickness. And what you see for their ES was that for the 22, the fixed set group, effect size 0.18. For the 4 set added group, effect size 0.37. For the 6 set added group, effect size 0.69. Similar results for the muscle thickness, 0.19, 0.34, 0.74. And just for perspective, an effect size of 0.10 or lower is considered small. Between 1.1 and 0.3 is considered medium. And then above 0.5 is considered large. So they were all above the small level. The 4 set per week, per 2-week group just surpassed the medium level. And the highest volume group did surpass the large effect size group, which is probably why all of the screeching cretins in the fitness industry really, see, high volume is better, 50 sets is better, they grew more, meh, 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 meh. But you can also see that the percentage changes did go up with a lot of variance. Even if the largest group was higher, the standard deviations were enormous, which was shown in those previous graphs. Discussion to kind of wrap this up, because the researchers actually kind of address the statistics in a way that I'm willing to bet you nobody in the industry actually represented accurately. So again, they talk about the 1RM strength gains. Yeah, they gained more strength in the higher volume groups. Well, medium and higher were the same because performing more squats is practice at squatting. But nobody gives a shit about that. What about the hypertrophy results? Regarding muscle hypertrophy, despite differences in volume load, all resistance training schemes led to significant muscle growth, with a pooled mean increase of 3.3 centimeters squared for vastus lateralis and 0.8 centimeters for summed muscle thickness. Let me note again that we need to divide that value, again inaccurately, in half. So that's actually 0.4 for the vastus lateralis and 0.4 for the rectus femoris. Again, I'm assuming that they were evenly growth. It's probably not a good assumption, but regardless. The reason I bring that up is the paper I talked about last week showed that most studies show a growth in muscle over 6 to 12 weeks of maybe 0.3 to 0.4 centimeters. Other than Brad's, which were unrealistically high. These values pass the reality check because it does represent two muscles added together. It would be nice to have the individual muscle data, but they didn't do that. The within-group analysis suggested a slightly graded increase in cross-sectional area across the fixed 4-set and 6-set groups, with corresponding effect sizes of 0.18, 0.37, and 0.69. Note their use of the word slightly, which I bet nobody else in the industry actually mentioned. They continue. A similar effect was observed for sum of muscle thickness across the fixed 4 and 6 set groups, with corresponding effect sizes of 0.19, 0.34, 0.74, respectively. Exact same thing I said before. There was a difference, but it was small. Moving on. Here's where it gets important. They state, to further explore this effect, we conducted an additional mixed model analysis. The notable differences were observed between the 6-set group and the fixed set group. However, multiple comparison confidence intervals for cross-sectional area compressed uncertainties that range from negative 0.6 square centimeters to 5.3. Similar findings were observed for sum of muscle thickness with a confidence interval ranging from a negligible null effect to a positive effect, negative 0.07 to 1.4 centimeters in favor of the highest in the 6-set group and the 22-set group. In addition, multiple comparisons for 4 versus 6 set group indicated no differences for both cross-sectional area and sum of muscle thickness, suggesting that if there is this potential small benefit of higher volume conditions, it may plateau after a certain weekly set number. I know that was complicated, but did you get it? Basically, with the huge variances and overlap, they can't really draw any strong conclusions. And they said, at best, higher volumes may have a small benefit with a plateau above a certain point, which, as the graph showed, was at that moderate volume group, which is still a huge number of sets, 42 fucking sets per week. But again, with the overlap, they couldn't even draw that strong of a conclusion. I'm willing to bet you no one in the industry mentioned that either. Then, like good scientists, they do another examination of the literature, and I'm not going to screenshot this, I'm just going to read it. However, when comparing the absolute changes in muscle thickness among different studies, the high volume groups in Schoenfeld and Brigado showed increases of 1.4 centimeters, sum of muscle thickness, and 0.34 centimeters vastus lateralis, respectively, while our 52 set group had an increase of 1.06 centimeters, sum of muscle thickness. Additionally, Abidal reported a 0.72 centimeter increase in the sum of muscle thickness for the low volume group, 12 weekly sets. Collectively, these findings suggest that there may be a threshold for the resistance training volume, which further increases in weekly sets may not result in additional muscle hypertrophy. Then they talk about it is problematic to compare different studies because of all kinds of variables. Therefore, future research is needed to understand better the effects of different resistance training volumes on hypertrophic adaptations and determine whether the differences in muscle growth observed between high, middle, and low volume conditions are clinically relevant for achieving aesthetic and performance goals in resistance-trained individuals. In addition to the practical meaningfulness of the hypertrophic differences between groups, the higher volume thresholds required substantial increases in time needed to complete a resistance training session. During the intervention's final weeks, participants in fixed set group completed their sessions in approximately 50 minutes, while those in the 4 and 6 set groups required around 100 minutes. Thus, caution should be exercised when incorporating these higher volume approaches in resistance training programs, particularly regarding adherence aspects, as it demands twice the duration of low to moderate volume resistance training sessions. And inasmuch as I do not read the blathering of all the talking heads in this industry, I'm willing to bet that got left out. The researchers even acknowledge that any differences in growth, if they were there at all, were small and probably irrelevant. Even if they were relevant on any level, you would have to do twice as much training with twice as much long of a workout to achieve that insignificant growth. That is not a useful investment on your time. It's not. But here's the other issue. This was quadriceps only. They did a little bit of hamstring work. Who the fuck knows what the subject did for upper body? Not that I think it matters. This was quads only. How are you going to apply this for the whole body? There are roughly 8 major muscle groups: chest, back, shoulders, biceps, triceps, quads, hamstrings, glutes, calves. There's actually 9. Do you intend to start with reasonable volumes and build up till you're doing 450 hard sets per week? Really? Really? Sure. Research finally talk about the limitations like all good scientists. Dietary tracking don't care. The trying to minimize confounding effects of previous training volumes, whatever. One thing they bring up what I just said. The manipulation of volume focused specifically on the quadriceps musculature. Participants performed only 4 total sets targeting the posterior lower body musculature, and upper body training was left to their discretion. Thus, our results cannot be generalized to performing similarly high volumes across all muscle groups during a given training cycle. To this point, the sustainability of such progression schemes for longer periods remains unclear, as some participants reported excessive perceived fatigue in the final weeks of the intervention period. No shit. Fourth, we only assessed hypertrophy in the lateral aspects of the thigh. It is unknown if similar hypertrophic adaptations would occur in other muscles, such as the rectus femoris or upper limb muscles. And then finally, the ideal length of progression periods for those progressive resistance training volumes remain unclear. Sixth, our findings are specific to resistance-trained males and cannot necessarily be generalized to other populations. I would add the issue that I brought up last week, which is that they did the ultrasound 72 hours after the last workout, and we have no indication that that's long enough for swelling after massive volumes to have gone down. I did mention that the total average growth in the lateral thigh was 0.8 centimeters. We split that in half, that's 0.4 apiece, and that does seem to be within the realm of possibility, considering what I talked about last week. But we still don't know. We still don't know, or we need to know, is all the swelling down after 26 fucking sets of quad work? But because of that, we don't even know if the supposedly small difference in growth between groups was real muscle growth rather than just water. Without that data, it's a guess. And I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm saying we don't know. Finally, the researchers conclude. Our findings indicate that a resistance training volume of 22 sets per week promotes significant lower body strength and hypertrophy adaptations in resistance-trained males over 12 weeks. Our findings further suggest that adding 4 or 6 sets per week every 2 weeks targeting the lower limb may elicit greater strength. But note again, that's not exactly what happened. The number of squat sets increased from 8 per week to 14 to 18. They were only adding a set or 2 of squats every 2 weeks. Certainly not 4 and 6. Regardless, moving on. While our results indicate a potential small benefit for higher volume conditions regarding hypertrophic adaptations in this population, the limited certainty of our findings warrants caution. Nevertheless, the fixed 22 weekly sets and the progressive approaches seem viable options. It is worth noting that the 4 and 6 sets progression require more time to complete the training sessions, which could be a consideration with making programming decisions, you think? Furthermore, during the final 2 weeks of the intervention, the 6 sets progression group performed 52 weekly sets. Despite one isolated response, by which I mean the guy that shrank, this observation indicates a potential new upper threshold for lower body training volume targeting the quads, as it did not negatively affect muscular adaptations. God damn, is that last sentence some politicking, because they basically said, well, except for one guy that shrank, the highest volume group didn't hurt hypertrophy. Yeah, and it didn't help, and it took twice as fucking long. So why would you bother? If you can get the same growth from low or even moderate volumes and still be able to actually train the whole body and not get exhausted and not break yourself, why would you bother to get a potentially tiny and still uncertain amount of growth? And the answer to that question is that if you would, or if you're one of the fitness experts who jumped on this paper because it fit their bias, who are recommending it, then you are too fucking dumb to be helped. And that includes the fitness professionals, which brings me to my final point. So what's the real conclusion here? The main one is that despite the blathering and screeching of the fitness pro, online fitness professionals about this study, it doesn't seem to say what they said it said. At best, the highest volume groups had a little bit more growth. And even then, there was no difference between moderate and highest. Like every other study that's ever been done, including Brad's, despite him misrepresenting the statistics and having a posse of butt lickers to back it up. Either studies show no dose response, as I talked about in the previous week's video, or occasionally that moderate is better than suboptimal. The highest is never superior. And the researchers even say that, on top of it, well, it didn't hurt, for fuck's sake. But here's the bigger conclusion. After you watch this, I want you to go back and look at all the little edgy Instagram posts and the memes of all the people that jumped on this paper. And I want you to see if they represented the data the way the paper actually showed it, the way the screenshots I gave, or the shit I read to you and bored you out of your mind with. Did they accurately represent the study? I'm willing to bet you they didn't. In fact, I guarantee you that they didn't. Because the real conclusion you should get from my 36-minute video is to stop fucking listening to these people. They never represent the data properly. Ever. They expect you to trust what they say the paper says. But the paper literally never says what they say it does. And I hopefully have shown that by showing you the screenshots. That's why I do it. I don't want anybody to trust me on what a paper says. I want you to see what it says. I want you to see what the researcher says. See what the results actually showed. They don't do that because they know you won't go check. The real conclusion to draw from this video is that A, low to moderate volumes are always better. The highest volumes can't ever be applied practically. But most importantly, you need to stop fucking listening to those people, because they never represent the data accurately. For the record, I neither read nor respond to comments on Instagram or YouTube. Also, I don't delete them like the other cowards in this industry. Go put a critical comment on any of their posts. Brad will just delete it and block you, and most of them will do the same thing. I don't care. Want to call me names and tell me I'm full of shit? Cool. Want to tell me I'm great and you want to have my children? Also cool. Want to ask me a question? Great, but I won't see any of it because I have better things to do, like rewatch Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I might start doing a Q&A again, in which case I'll give an email to send me questions, but I might not. I might do another video, or I might not. There's no telling with me. So, like this video, don't like it, learn from it, don't learn from it. I mainly do these for my own benefit, so there you go. Have a good one, dumb shits.